Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. Very happy to have Stephen Kosslyn on today's show. Unfortunately, we had a little bit of trouble with my recording. My audio is a little low, so apologies for that. But overall, it's a great conversation, and we wanted to make sure everyone had a chance to listen. We hope you enjoy. Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. Very happy to be joined again by Dr. Stephen Kosslyn, the president and founder of Foundry College. Wonderful guest, was on maybe a month and a half, 2 months ago, and had so much to talk about that we wanted to bring him back. Stephen, welcome back to Trending in Education.
Thank you, Mike. It's really a pleasure.
Yeah, and when we were together last time, I would recommend folks, if they get a chance, listen to that episode. It gives a good overview of your storied career trajectory, which we can reference as needed, and then also gave a nice summary of what Foundry College is doing, how it's structured, and how you approach teaching online. And we can dig back into some of those pieces as relevant. We talked about the power of synchronous. But I hear you've been working on something new. I'd love to hear more from you about what you've been up to and what you started to work on.
I've been struck by how unsatisfactory a lot of the courses that were moved to Zoom ended up being.
Yes.
You know, there was this just sudden, I mean, it's nobody's fault. I mean, it's like, you know, all of 3 days to prepare.
Right.
And it turned out that just giving your standard lecture on Zoom wasn't exactly captivating, wasn't particularly effective.
Mm-hmm.
So I've thought a fair amount about why.
Right.
And it seems to me that it really comes down to the science of learning. That is how the brain works. Things didn't work out so well given that modality. So I'm writing a book, almost finished. First draft. It's called Active Learning in the Digital Age currently. I don't know if that'll end up being the title, but it's about 6 principles from learning science and how to apply them online teaching.
Awesome. You had me at hello. I was curious right off, even with the title, because active learning, there's a lot to unpack in that turn of phrase, which has been around for quite some time. And you also had me at a listicle, 6 items that we can talk through together. I think is a fantastic way to structure this conversation. We could begin a little more high level, even before you get into the 6 principles. What's the purpose of the book? What's the main point that the folks need to understand out there?
The main point is that we should stop focusing so much on teaching and focus more on learning. And as soon as you do that, you start asking, well, how does learning actually work? Mm-hmm. And then you can actually return to teaching, but from the focus of what you should do to try to help students learn.
That's fantastic. Yeah, because we've talked about it on the show, the distinction between education and learning. I hadn't heard that about teaching, but I think that is also spot on in that it's really the teacher's job to understand the learner first. And then if you are truly learner-centric in how you're teaching and supporting the learner, it's really not about you, it's about the learner.
Right. So, you know, this old adage is it's easy to teach 1,000 people with a lecture as 10 people, which kind of really exposes what went wrong with the whole Zoom approach of just giving lectures. I mean, you know, they scale beautifully. I mean, an infinite number of people presumably could watch the same video, but they're not necessarily going to learn much. And you just hit on one reason why.
Have you seen counterexamples to Zoom even within this window of time? I love the Gibson quote, "The future's here now, it's just not evenly distributed." The idea that there are places where the active learning that you're talking about, the really next-gen, personalized, learner-centered, even human-mediated, there's a teacher or coach helping the learner through that experience, but it's really designed around the learner. Are there examples you've seen that are great counterpoints to Zoom?
Yeah, well, Minerva is a good example, but you know, we built Foundry College with this in mind from the start. What struck me about it was that at Foundry, we built technology with active learning in mind to deliver the courses. Yeah. And I started thinking, well, say you didn't want to use that technology, you just want to use Zoom or blue jeans or whatever.
Right.
What kind of workarounds? Because it wasn't built. Zoom was built as a general purpose video conferencing platform, not a teaching platform.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's not set up in a way that affords, that makes it easy to do the kind of active learning that we know is so effective.
Right.
So a lot of what's in this book is kind of little workarounds, how you use CSV files in a spreadsheet to set up breakout groups in advance. It's short. It's going to be like 100, 120 pages long. It's very short.
Sure.
There's an appendix which has got every active learning technique I can think of or find.
Yeah.
It's there. But the book is built around these principles because that's what makes active learning work. The active ingredient of active learning is the way the brain works.
Right.
I mean, that's why active learning is effective.
Right.
That it plays into certain proclivities and ways that we want to process information and the consequences of processing information in certain ways.
Interesting. There's this e-learning textbook near my desk, which I do use pretty regularly. And that's Clark and Meyer's book, but that's somewhat older. So what you wrote just now, I think, is a similar orientation. I like to say I've been an ad hoc instructional designer for 20 years, and I feel like in the last 3 months, the rest of the world suddenly caught up to me. And suddenly everyone's thinking, how do I design this learning? How do I get Zoom up and running? How do I handle the tech complexities? That alone is an initial hurdle. And then from there, can you do it well? And then from there, to your point, is there friction? Does it lack the affordances that should make it easy for me as an instructor to curate an experience for my learners? All this stuff sounds super relevant. I like to say zeitgeisty. So I think you're sort of surfing the collective consciousness these days in terms of really meeting an unmet need, which is helping educators who are stretched in so many dimensions, including just emotionally. It's hard to lean in. It's hard to lean into change. And then the amount of energy you have to exert to be an engaging online instructor is something we've also talked quite a bit about. So I think you can get some of that active learning, but it takes a lot of exertion from the instructor. And then there's not as much feedback back from the learners in that context. So yeah, I'd love to hear more. I don't know if you wanted to outline the principles, also any depth on active learning that is a little more textbook, if you will, if there is a way to understand what active learning is.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of different definitions. The simplest is learning by doing, which I don't like. The reason I don't like it is that you need a goal. You need to have some learning outcome. So just having a discussion is not really active learning. There's got to be some reason you're having the discussion, and it's got to be structured in a way that'll help you move closer to reaching that goal.
Interesting.
Otherwise, I don't think of it really as active learning because I'm not sure there's really learning involved.
Yeah.
So,
and I have heard the term. I think John Maida was the guy who was referenced. He said this. He talked about stealth learning, where, and this is sort of the notion of edutainment as well, where I have an entertaining, like a leisure experience, and then at the end of the leisure experience, I actually learned. There might have been intent on the designer's part to say, we'll provide something entertaining, but then hopefully this message will also get out to the learner. But in that case, it wouldn't really be active learning unless I said, I'm going to watch this series to learn these things. Like the learner needs intent.
I'm not sure. I'm very outcomes oriented. If the learner ends up having learned something, whether they wanted to or not, it was still active learning. If they learned it, they acquired it via doing something.
But the measurement part then becomes important as
well. Right. So from my point of view, this is where the teaching and learning come together. That from the instructor's point of view, the teacher's point of view, you want to have clear learning outcomes. You want to know what it is you're trying to teach them to do.
Right.
And from the learner's point of view, as long as they come out with that learning outcome, they almost definitionally learned it.
Right.
So part of what's going on, just go to one of my principles here.
Sure.
Is a principle of deep processing. It turns out, let me ask you a question. I may have asked you this before. I don't remember. At the end of the day, did I ask you about this?
Yes, you did. I remember.
Yeah. You remember it. Okay.
Yeah.
So perfect. So I asked you at the end of the day how much, if you ever reflected back on what happened during the day.
Yeah. I said I did not too much, but more than the percentage. It was a relatively, I think it was like 5% or 10%. It was a low number.
That's right. So most people, when you talk to them, and I've done this with thousands of people, well, what I typically do is ask people, If at the end of the day, they reflect back on what they did during the day, most people say they did, then I ask them to raise their hands if they intentionally tried to memorize what they later remembered 50% of the time. And nobody's ever done that.
Right.
So, and then I say, all right, how about 25%? I think I have now 3 that have said that. Then I go down in 5% increments, and it's about 5%.
Yeah.
Is the modal number that is estimated for how much you try to remember what you actually do remember at the end of the day when you think back over the day.
Right.
And the reason for that is deep processing. And the reason you, Mike, remember this example is because by my asking you to think about it, you processed it. And it turns out a lot of our memory is just a byproduct of deep processing.
Right.
So you can build this into asynchronous lesson plans. As long as there's some kind of a work product or consequence that they're going to get feedback on so that they're going to be motivated to do it, you can get people to do deep processing. One of the interconnections is another principle called deliberate practice, with Anders Ericsson really developed. The key example is if you're learning a foreign language, you might get a tutor and say a word, try to get the pronunciation right, and then the tutor would say it back correctly. And then deliberate practice is about listening to the disparity between what you said and what the tutor said, and then saying it again, trying to reduce the delta, the difference between what you initially said and what the tutor said. So it's not just saying it over and over again. It's not just practice. It's deliberate. You're consciously monitoring and trying to improve. So you need feedback for that. But it turns out some of the feedback can be self-generated. Really good golfers in a tournament, the day before, apparently they often will play the course, and they'll sometimes do a hole like 5 or 6 times, shots in the same hole, to get feedback from themselves, just to see how they did and notice what they did, what the consequences were, so they can tune themselves up for what they should do in the tournament. Or Winston Churchill used to give a speech to himself in a mirror.
Right.
So he knew, he had internalized the standards. Okay, so he can give himself feedback. So it's amazing. As long as you externalize it.
It reminds me of 2 things. When I listen back to this podcast, I'm getting feedback on my own performance, and then I am using it to get better. The other example, it reminds me of practicing my free throws, where is the ball coming off the tips of my fingers? How am I lining it up? And you get very methodical to the point, and then you're measuring. The nice thing about the free throw shooting is you can keep track of your percentage, so you can tweak and adjust. But it almost seems like that methodical understanding of your own performance, and then understanding the feedback as you adjust to try to get better.
Yeah, the world can give you the feedback. You throw towards a hoop and you hit it on the rim. And as long as you paid attention to what you did, you can use the feedback to try to correct. So this can be used also asynchronously, by the way.
Right.
I mean, you can have people do some kind of an exercise or solve a problem, post the answer on a bulletin board, and then the next student who finishes, you'll swap. You'll grade them and they'll grade you. So this can all be done asynchronously, and you can get feedback that'll help you correct.
I like where you went with asynchronous too, because for me, when I think asynchronous, I think not human mediated, but you just mean not synchronous. So, So that means if there is a message board or Slack channel or a parallel feedback, and it's human, and even in this case, maybe peer-to-peer, which I think is really interesting, because I think that's more emotionally charged. We are social animals. I remember we even talked about this on our last conversation, is that adding some social valence, some social capital to what's in it for me, why am I motivated, is a really critical component.
And that leads to the third principle I'll mention, which is incentives and consequences are really important. So a lot of the consequences are social. That is, you're going to do something because of how other people are going to reward it or not, depending on what you do. And incentives are anticipating, or looking ahead what the consequences will be. So you can design active learning with incentives and consequences in mind from the very beginning by setting up breakout groups where students have to do something
Yeah,
as part of the, yeah.
I have to say, my wife, love her dearly, has heard me talk about BATNAs on a few occasions based on our previous conversation. I really did enjoy how you brought like real life examples. There was relevance to the way in which things were taught. Even when I was talking before about shooting baskets, the idea of turn this into something that is personally relevant to me is really interesting, which relates to the consequences and benefits, motivation. Any examples in light of the race to Zoom that are either illustrative of doing it well or illustrative of not really paying attention to incentives and consequences?
Well, the typical way of just giving a lecture into a camera is a beautiful example of not doing it well, because there are no incentives to pay attention. Assuming that you can read the material book or something like that for a test. I mean, the biggest incentives and consequences in traditional education are tests, right?
Right.
People. So if there's other ways of learning this stuff, there's no incentive or consequences to listen to a lecture.
Well, one exception I would say is if you have an entertaining instructor, if you have an engaging motivation, the incentive is to also a surprising instructor. It's like at some point I might just do something crazy. It's like, oh my God, I gotta keep watching to see what this guy's gonna do. And like whether that's good or bad, I think that's part of why there is a certain magic to live that I think is an incentive for the learner to keep watching. Where I think to do that well asynchronously in terms of media, I think that's why I liked the peer-to-peer, social message board, Slack channel type stuff I find really interesting. But I think the video instruction, to design it in such a way that it can maintain the learner's attention, I think is challenging.
So I must say, hearing you talk about instructors being entertaining makes me take pause, because you look at the typical kind of instructor-professor evaluation at the end of the course, so they fill it out, which is a lot of it is, how interesting was it? And think of the incentives and consequences for the professor. I mean, that's a way, think about it in terms of deliberate practice. You're giving them the wrong signal back.
Wow, yeah.
You're shaping them to try to be more of an entertainer and less of somebody who actually is teaching them what they should know.
Right.
And by the way, you should decide whether those learning outcomes are worth teaching or not in advance.
Right.
If they're not going to be worth teaching, don't bother teaching them, obviously.
Right.
So it should be patently obvious that this material is worth learning because it's going to help you in your life and your work and so on. And if it's not obvious, then I don't know why you're taking the course.
I think there are intrinsic and extrinsic motivations now. I think
true.
So the idea is like great teaching frequently unlocks the intrinsic value of learning the material, and that frequently is human mediated. That frequently, I think you can do it asynchronously, but I think there is a certain level of inspiration, even if it's 5% of what you're doing, 10% of what you're doing. I think it's a critical component.
So I wonder, I mean, that's rationale behind a liberal arts education, which I think is wonderful if you are from a privileged background and have the luxury of being able to spend all that time just because it's going to be interesting and make you a better, more interesting person. I mean, I personally think a lot of that stuff that makes you a better rounded person you can do on your own or with other people voluntarily, like in book groups and things like that. And that it is a luxury that not everybody has. So I'm thinking that for me, and this is part of what Foundry College is about, a lot of education is really helping people have better lives, which is not a luxury. It's really sort of survival. It's more than survival. It's being able to thrive. And they need the tools for that. And that's what I'm interested in personally. I'm not I'm not saying this for everybody. I mean, there is a place for liberal arts education, but I think it's not for everybody.
Sure. I think my point is more the intrinsic value of doing what you love is something that I think is important for educators and, for even just modeling it. Like I've talked about how throughout my teaching career, I love teaching math. And it's partly because I genuinely love math. I'm not ashamed of it and I actually have fun with it. And I think that's that was part of what sort of brought people in to feel more comfortable experiencing it. I'm a big proponent of focusing on the intrinsic rewards, intrinsic incentives where you can, is frequently long-term beneficial for motivation, and particularly regardless of where the learner is coming from, ultimately where they want to go, they ideally will derive some intrinsic value from it, or at least find some meaning in the work. I think that's another thing
Right.
you were talking to us about
Right.
last time, was meaningful work.
Right.
Like, I think it's an evolution. Maybe it's not necessarily the teacher, it's more like the mentor, or more the trusted guide, which I think is becoming more it's almost like the social emotional component of the learner's journey is the thing that frequently, I still believe, we benefit from someone who's further down the road paying attention to us. And that typically is more like a human to human connection.
Oh, I agree with that.
Yeah.
I think the worst part about most asynchronous instruction is it cuts that out.
Yeah.
There's very little human interaction. So I think you can insert that. Some of it can be asynchronous, but
Yeah.
you can also have hybrid cases where
Yeah.
a lot of the asynchronous is kind of the run up.
Right.
And I'm not talking a flipped classroom where you do
Right.
all the work beforehand and then do homework in class.
Yeah.
I'm talking about an opportunity to get feedback for deliberate practice and ways of processing information more deeply and so forth.
Yeah.
When you get together.
Yeah, I'm excited to read your book because I think it's also a really interesting time to expand our language. Even as we were talking, I was just thinking about like flipped classroom and what do we mean by hybrid, and like what do we mean by asynchronous, when I think there could be much more detail and specificity. My comment before about ad hoc instructional design is kind of true. Like, I've always been more on the making side of the learning interventions. So I generally try to stay current in terms of the learning science, which is changing. And, I'm a psychology guy long term. So like, I've been tracking that domain since I was in college. But it is interesting that there's an opportunity, I think, to get more sophisticated in how we talk about our interventions. And it sounds as though good design thinking, thoughtful design applied to a learning program is something that I talk about a lot on the show. But that's why it's wonderful to have you on, because that's really been your track record, whether it was at Minerva or now at Foundry College. But what I think maybe we haven't had is as much like broad access. To your point, not everyone has access to the proprietary platform, or not everyone, within their particular school district or university, they may have to use a particular tool. And it sounds like you're saying there are these abstracted principles and practices that apply regardless of what you're using.
Totally right. Yeah. And they apply to all humans because of the way the brain works. And it's in every learning situation you can apply them. Asynchronous. If you want to make a video, there are better and worse ways to make videos.
Yeah.
So that's an asynchronous mode where they watch them.
Yeah.
So the same principles.
How many principles have we hit so far? Because I want to make sure, unless we I could edit it as a two-parter, but I want to make sure you and I get all 6 of them in, because they're
let me tell you the other ones really briefly then. I think we're about halfway through. We talked about incentives and consequences a little bit, deep processing and deliberate practice. So the other 3 are something called dual coding.
Yes.
Where
I like that one. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's pretty general. It's general to showing in general versus telling is a way to think about it. Mm-hmm. So it's typically talked about in terms of pictures and words.
Yes.
So you're going to remember a lot more. But it's actually more general than that.
Yeah, I love this one because as a podcaster, I talk about this one all the time, because I basically say, we're just communicating to our listeners in an auditory format, and it's basically auditory and text are similar in how we process them. So like the way I listen to the oral content, I hear the voice, I could read a transcript of the conversation, but that wouldn't actually add any value. What I'm always fascinated by is the picture superiority effect. Again, as a podcaster, the idea that if I'm trying to teach something just with audio, what picture should I pair, what visual stimuli should I pair with it, so that the learner is processing that using more than one perceptual modality, you know?
Yeah, but you can have the learner supply their own visual through
For sure.
visual mental imagery.
Yes.
So it turns out that's incredibly effective. I mean, you can like double your memory capacity if you start
Yes.
visualizing stuff.
Right. I remember talking to Yuki Terada from Edutopia, because he was talking about research about, I think, teaching while having your students draw a bicycle before you show them why the bicycle is designed a particular way. If you have people draw it, and this is almost like the feedback thing you're talking about too, that frequently people will learn the concept because they'll get it wrong in an interesting way. You know?
Making errors is a really important part of learning. And that's this business about desirable difficulty. You've got to be challenged, but not too much, or you just get frustrated. Not too little, you get bored. So that's really about optimal processing. So dual coding is you got to set it up so that they process the visual stuff and the verbal stuff as much as possible.
I also, full disclosure, Stephen, I do joke about being an olfactory learner, and I like to talk about being a kinesthetic learner too. Those are my two favorite things to joke about. But does that work in terms of dual coding? Well, smell is famously associated with like the hippocampus and the olfactory bulb and like, all that kind of stuff.
Oh, sure.
But like, it doesn't matter the modality. It's just we get the most information as a learner, I think, through either our visual or auditory, right?
That is correct. But it basically, the more the better in terms of modalities, and especially if you get them so they're interrelated. They're not just isolated.
Okay, cool. So the Kickstarter for Trending in Education Smell-O-Vision Edition is still in play. Good. Okay.
I suspect there are going to be some people who are going to say that idea stinks, but let's not go there. Okay. So dual coding, showing and telling. You want to do both. And then chunking is a really important one that we take in like 3 or 4 units. So when you mentioned something earlier about friction, a problem that a lot of faculty were facing is they had these lecture notes all set up for their traditional lectures. And so they just read them into the camera.
Right.
And it probably wasn't optimal when they were doing it live, but there was an opportunity for nonverbal interaction. You could see what the students were doing. Whatever, you knew when to pause, whatever, in a way that it's harder online.
Right.
So a way to take your lecture notes and spiff them up so they can be put online is take your exams and look at every question and then figure out where it was answered in your lectures. And think about anything that wasn't fed into an exam question. Think about why you have it there. Because presumably the exam questions are testing what was important, the learning outcomes.
Right.
And everything else unclear. So what you may want to think about is how do the key pieces of information that led to exam questions cluster, chunk, okay, and think about where to put active learning exercises at the end of each of these big chunks, and then B, what to eliminate. So chunking is really useful in terms of how you organize a lecture and how you would sort of upload it.
Yeah, that's interesting too, because I've always heard, maybe it's based on the original research, wasn't it 7 ± 2 was the original?
Yeah, George Miller, and that turns out to be wrong.
That's interesting. So it's fewer than that.
Yeah. There's a nice review by someone named Cowan. It's really 3 or 4.
Yeah. That's huge, though. I mean, and that's really interesting how the popular conception, based on good reason, not knocking Miller's research at the time, I'm sure it's probably more the application of it or whatever. Science continues to evolve and disprove what was canon. But it's really interesting that, I knew 7 ± 2. That's first year psych, and
unfortunately.
And then things change, So
right. Well, here's the tricky part. Each of those units itself can have units. So that's why it's hard sometimes to estimate the total.
Yeah.
Because each chunk, as it were, like a prefix for a telephone number,
exactly.
It's got 3 digits in it.
Yeah.
So in each of those digits, if you wrote them down, has segments, right? Vertical and horizontal. So the whole chunking thing is hierarchical. I mean, the beautiful example of this is this guy who's trained up so he could memorize 79 random digits, read one every second.
Wow.
Yeah, Erickson did this when he was working with Bill Chase as a graduate student.
Huh.
They brought in this undergraduate and asked him to sit down, volunteer,
Yeah.
and listen to digits.
Yeah.
A year and a half. He came at least 3 times a week. So the first session, they read him 1 digit. He could
Yeah.
repeat it back just fine.
Nice.
Then they gave him 2 digits, random.
Does he get does he get a snack based on the number of digits, or like there's
no? Well, he was intrinsically motivated. For all I know, they paid him. I don't actually know if he was paid or not. But the point is, over time, he figured out ways to organize digits. He was a marathon runner, and he would map the digits into times. So 1 second for whatever. I mean, 1 minute for 42 seconds, 0.3 or something. He would map them in, and then remember segments of races and organize them up into a hypothetical marathon he could have run.
Wow, it's like the method of loci, right?
Yeah, that's another way you can do it.
Yeah.
But so he worked out this way where he was able at the end to take 79, one every second randomly, and organize them up.
Yeah.
And it's very hierarchical.
Yeah.
So, little times, and then times add up to a segment, and then segments would end up to a whatever.
I'm always amazed what the mind can do on seemingly irrelevant tasks, but like if you can motivate it, it advances science. Like this ultimately is a net benefit. Because are you saying this is the related research that kind of debunked the size?
Yeah, because it turns out it's 4s. That is, you got groups of 3 or 4, and then super groups of those 3 or 4 on top of those, and so on. It's very hierarchical.
It kind of makes sense in terms of even like designing a presentation or trying to get enough information out. You don't want to say, I have 7 things to tell you today in my lecture, because people are going to kind of check out because they don't even know, what do I really need to pay attention to?
Correct.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So my 6 principles is pushing it.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, I know, but looking at the literature, I used to have 16. I was able to boil them down, and I realized some of them weren't actually independent principles. They were actually combinations of principles.
Tree structure up from the 6 into 3 or 4.
I did it from the 16. I got to 6.
Gotta have boundaries.
The best I could do. The best I could do.
So we're getting there, though, right? So
that
was chunking.
There you go.
You got to remember chunking. If you forget chunking, you're not paying attention. Yeah.
There you are. So the last one is associations.
Okay.
And one, so they're important for organizing. So some chunking is done via associations.
Yeah.
But also for storing it, and also for digging it out later.
Yeah.
So associations are really important for learning. And one of the reasons that associations are so important is that we later remember things based on cues that prompt us. So context is really important. The more different contexts you can learn things in, the better.
Yeah. Well, associations also makes me think of, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it is also where when you're teaching by analogy, or you're trying to associate with, also good storytelling frequently is all about associations.
And chunking.
And chunking.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. That's right.
This is I'm excited. So how is the book gonna be released? What kind of
I don't know.
are you on?
I did something really weird. I published, I don't know how many books, well over a dozen. I haven't counted, but this is the first one. Oh, that's not true. The very first book I ever wrote, which was called Image and Mind, published in 1980.
Right.
I wrote the entire thing beforehand. It was like initially 900 pages. I cut it way back.
Wow.
I cut it way back. But this one is the only other book since then that I've actually going to write the whole thing first, and then we'll get a contract for it.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Yeah.
So book publishers listen in, and it's interesting in terms of format too, as you're describing it. One thing that we have talked a lot about on the show is like what is a book nowadays, and how do people consume their information? Is it through a book? Is it through a workbook? Could it be an online experience? Like the blending is interesting. So for you as a researcher and a thinker, in some ways there's more opportunity now to think about how do you just spread the word. The book obviously is an organizing structure that'll get it's great that you have it. It's really sort of the starting place in a lot of ways, but it's exciting to think this day and age, how many formats and touch points you can
True.
sort of expand the outreach. Have you thought about that at all?
Yeah, quite a bit.
Yeah.
Unclear. That's one of the
Yeah.
reasons I didn't just do the traditional thing from the beginning.
That is interesting, just to think about how you could get the word out in this day and age, even using the principles, using the 6 principles to communicate the 6 principles out, you know?
Yeah, well, that's right. It's kind of recursive. That,
Yeah.
in fact, in the book, I do a lot of that. I
Yeah.
actually use the principles to teach the principles, but I don't often point it out. But the key really is combinations of these principles. That's when you get really the power.
Yeah.
That you want to do deep processing with the deliberate practice for feedback,
Yeah.
but you want to organize it in advance using the chunking.
Mm-hmm.
You're really well off if you can show as well as tell using
Yeah.
dual processing. And of course, part of the goal is to set up associations.
Yeah.
So
What I'd love to see maybe coming out of this will be interesting too is, you know, could we establish a community of practice among educators who are drawing from these principles to provide some peer-to-peer feedback interaction? So
wow, great idea.
certainly among our listeners, any of you who are educators or ad hoc instructional designers, many more of us are wearing those hats these days. This book will be coming out. We'll sort out the best way to get the principles out there. We'll continue to talk about them when we can on the show. We'll love to get Stephen back as often as possible. But this is the type of information that really will help you move the needle as someone who's trying to navigate these tumultuous times of ours. And it's really wonderful, Stephen, that we have folks like yourself who are able to both withstand the tumults and then also formulate some really useful thinking, useful tools that hopefully people out in the world will find relevant and engaging. Any final thoughts for our listeners?
Well, just once again to thank you, Mike. This has been stimulating, interesting conversation, and I really appreciate your interest and time. And I look forward to at some point actually meeting you in the flesh.
Yeah, we're in the same city, so you never know. Yeah.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
well, let's hope that we continue making progress on containing this plague.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Yeah.
So our listeners, Dr. Stephen Kosslyn, president and founder of Foundry College, also has written numerous books and has a new book coming. Working title one more time, Stephen?
Active Learning in the Digital Age, which is probably a mouthful, so it might end up being something simpler, but that's the idea behind it.
Yeah, some great active learning, some great stuff shared on today's show. We'll be back again soon on Trending in Education.